I'll never forget standing beside that mahogany casket in the pouring rain, watching my own family pretend I didn't exist. While my cousins wore designer suits and my aunts clutched expensive purses, I stood there in my only black dress, the same one I'd worn to my high school graduation 3 years ago. They whispered among themselves about board meetings and company valuations, completely ignoring the granddaughter who'd spent every summer working alongside the man they were burying. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that in exactly 72 hours, I would own everything they thought belonged to them. My name is Alex Thompson, and this is the story of how a single envelope changed my life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The September morning when everything changed started like any other funeral in Cedar Falls, Ohio. Gray clouds hung heavy over Riverside Cemetery as our small town gathered to say goodbye to Robert Thompson, the man everyone called Mr. Bob. He'd been more than just the owner of 3 successful companies. He'd been the heartbeat of our community for over 40 years. The guy who never laid off a worker during tough times and always made sure families had what they needed around Christmas. But as I stood there watching dirt hit his coffin, all I could feel was the cold shoulder from my own blood relatives. My Aunt Victoria kept adjusting her black Chanel jacket and checking her Rolex, clearly more concerned with the impression she was making than the man we were losing. Her husband, David, stood beside her like a perfectly pressed statue, nodding seriously at the other business owners who'd come to pay their respects. My Uncle James had flown in from Chicago that morning, still wearing his investment banker uniform of sharp suits and sharper attitudes. Even my own mother, Elizabeth, seemed more interested in networking with the other mourners than acknowledging that my daughter existed. I watched my cousin Michael throw an arm around my uncle's shoulder, both of them scanning the crowd like they were counting potential business contacts rather than mourning a patriarch. The message was crystal clear without anyone saying a word. I was the outsider, the family member who didn't quite fit the mold they'd created for themselves. While they'd all gone off to prestigious universities and built careers in finance and management, I'd stayed home and gotten my hands dirty working construction with Grandpa Bob every summer since I turned 16. Standing there in that cemetery, rain soaking through my worn shoes, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. These people shared my DNA, but we might as well have been strangers. They'd written me off years ago as the family disappointment, the girl who chose community college and trade skills over business school and boardrooms. What they couldn't see, what they'd never bothered to notice, was that while they were building their resumes, I was building something much more valuable with the man they were burying. I was building trust. Part 2. Protagonist Establishment. My name is Alex Thompson, and at 21 years old, I was supposed to be figuring out my life like every other college graduate. Instead, I was standing at my grandfather's funeral feeling like I'd lost my best friend and my only true family member all at once. For as long as I could remember, Grandpa Bob had been my anchor in a family that seemed to drift further away from me with each passing year. Growing up, while my cousins spent their summers at expensive camps and European vacations, I spent mine learning how to operate a backhoe and read construction blueprints. My hands were permanently stained with motor oil, and my back ached from hauling lumber, but those were the happiest days of my childhood. Grandpa Bob never talked down to me or treated me like I was just a kid getting in the way. He taught me how engines worked, how to spot quality materials, and most importantly, how to treat people with respect, regardless of whether they wore suits or work boots. This moment was supposed to be about celebrating his life and carrying on his legacy. I'd imagined that maybe, finally, my family would see the connection I'd had with him and recognize that I'd learned valuable lessons during all those summers. I thought they might understand that business wasn't just about spreadsheets and profit margins, that it was about people and relationships and understanding what really mattered. But as I stood there watching them network at a funeral, I realized I'd been naive to hope they'd ever see me as anything more than the granddaughter who'd chosen the wrong path. The weight of losing him hit me in waves throughout that gray morning. This wasn't just about missing family gatherings or awkward holiday dinners anymore. This was about losing the one person who'd believed in me when nobody else did. Grandpa Bob had always told me that real strength came from doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy, even when people didn't appreciate it. He taught me that dignity meant more than dollars, and that the measure of a person wasn't found in their bank account, but in how they treated others when nobody was watching. Standing in that cemetery, I had no idea that within days, everything I thought I knew about my place in this family would be turned completely upside down. Part 3. The immediate injustice. The reading of the will took place 3 days later in Margaret Walsh's downtown law office, a cramped space above Miller's Diner that smelled like coffee and old paper. The entire family crammed into her small conference room, everyone dressed in their finest clothes, like they were attending another networking event rather than settling their father's final affairs. I sat in the back corner, still wearing my work clothes from my part-time job at the local auto shop, feeling like I was intruding on a meeting that didn't concern me. Margaret cleared her throat and began reading through the standard legal language that nobody really listens to. Minor bequests went around the room. Victoria received grandmother's jewelry collection and smiled with the satisfaction of someone collecting trophies. James inherited the antique gun collection and nodded approvingly, already calculating its auction value. My mother got the family china set and various household items, accepting them with the practiced grace of someone who expected exactly what she received. But then, Margaret reached what everyone had been waiting for. Regarding the business interests of Thompson Manufacturing, Cedar Valley Construction Supply, and Midwest Logistics Solutions. The room went completely silent. Straightened in her chair, her MBA training kicking in as she prepared to accept what she'd always assumed was her birthright as the eldest child. James leaned forward, his investment banking background making him confident he'd be chosen to handle the financial complexities. Even my mother perked up, perhaps thinking she might finally get a piece of the empire she'd grown up watching her father build. These assets, valued at approximately $15 million and employing over 200 community members, are to be held in trust. Margaret paused, looking around the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. For Alexandra Thompson, upon completion of her business management certification program, which she will begin within 6 months of this reading. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face turned white, then red, then settled into a shade I'd never seen before. James started sputtering about legal challenges and probate court. My mother looked like someone had slapped her. David began muttering about family lawyers and second opinions. Michael just stared at me with undisguised hatred, like I'd personally stolen something that belonged to him. But what hurt most was the immediate assumption that this had to be some kind of mistake. Not one of them considered, even for a moment, that maybe Grandpa Bob had made this decision deliberately. Not one of them thought that perhaps he'd seen something in me that they'd all missed. Instead, Victoria immediately demanded to see the documentation, James started making phone calls to his lawyer contacts, and my mother began questioning Margaret about the validity of the will. I sat there in stunned silence while my own family treated my inheritance like a crime that needed to be investigated. Part 4. The Origin Flashback. To understand how I got to that moment in Margaret Walsh's office, you have to go back to when I was 8.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Years old, and spending my first real summer with Grandpa Bob. My parents had just gotten divorced, and Mom needed somewhere to send me while she figured out her new life as a single mother. Most kids would have been devastated to spend their summer vacation working at construction sites, but for me it was like discovering a whole new world. Grandpa Bob picked me up that first morning in his battered Ford pickup truck, the radio playing classic country music and the cab smelling like coffee and sawdust. He didn't talk to me like I was a fragile little girl who needed to be protected from the real world. Instead, he handed me a pair of work gloves and told me I was going to learn what it meant to build something with your own hands. We drove to a job site where his crew was framing a house for a young family who'd saved for years to afford their first home. That summer, I learned more about life than I had in all my previous years of school combined. I watched Grandpa Bob negotiate with suppliers, not by demanding the lowest prices, but by building relationships based on mutual respect. I saw him solve problems on job sites not by yelling or throwing money around, but by listening to his workers and trusting their expertise. When one of his employees had a family emergency, I watched him personally cover the man's wages and make sure his health insurance stayed active. Every summer after that, I spent my vacation time learning different aspects of the business. By the time I was 12, I could read architectural plans and spot potential problems before construction started. At 14, I was helping coordinate supply deliveries and learning how to manage inventory. When I turned 16, Grandpa Bob taught me to operate heavy machinery and understand the complexities of running multiple companies simultaneously. But the most important lessons weren't about business operations. They were about character. I watched him treat the janitor at the office with the same respect he showed to his biggest clients. I saw him drive across town to personally apologize when a delivery was late, even though it wasn't directly his fault. When economic downturns hit the region, I witnessed him take personal pay cuts rather than lay off workers, understanding that these jobs weren't just paychecks, but lifelines for entire families. While my cousins were learning about stock portfolios and corporate strategy in their expensive schools, I was learning about loyalty, integrity, and the kind of leadership that inspires people rather than intimidates them. Grandpa Bob never explicitly told me I was being groomed to take over the companies, but looking back, every lesson he taught me was preparation for exactly that responsibility. Part 5. The grinding effort. For 13 summers, I immersed myself in every aspect of those 3 companies with an intensity that my family mistook for simple teenage summer jobs. While Victoria was interning at prestigious investment firms and James was building his network at business school mixers, I was crawling through muddy trenches, learning how to install water lines, and staying up until midnight helping Grandpa Bob reconcile accounts that didn't balance. The work was brutal in ways my family couldn't understand. Construction starts before dawn, especially during the summer months when you're racing against weather and deadlines. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, grab coffee and a breakfast sandwich, and spend the next 10 hours learning how to frame houses, pour foundations, and coordinate the dozens of moving pieces that go into completing a project on time and under budget. My hands developed permanent calluses, my arms grew strong from hauling materials, and my back learned to handle the constant strain of physical labor. But the real education happened in the offices after the job sites shut down for the day. While Grandpa Bob's administrative staff went home to their families, I stayed behind learning how to read financial statements, understand contract negotiations, and manage the complex logistics of keeping 3 separate companies profitable. I learned that Thompson manufacturing wasn't just about producing metal components, it was about understanding the needs of clients and delivering solutions that exceeded their expectations. Cedar Valley Supply required managing relationships with hundreds of contractors while maintaining inventory levels that could handle both emergency orders and seasonal fluctuations. Midwest Logistics Solutions was perhaps the most complex, coordinating shipping and transportation for companies throughout the region while managing a fleet of trucks and a team of drivers who needed to feel valued and supported. Each company required different skills, different approaches, and different types of leadership. While my cousins were learning theoretical business principles in classrooms, I was getting hands-on experience solving real problems with real consequences. The hardest part wasn't the physical demands or even the long hours. It was watching my cousins flaunt their degrees and corporate internships while my palms grew number and thicker and my back ached from the weight of heavy equipment. They saw me as the kid who wasn't smart enough to make it in the business world, not the person who was choosing to learn from the ground up.
The complexity of the work, it was watching my family dismiss everything I was learning as just playing around with tools and trucks. When I try to share insights about supply chain management or labor relations during family dinners, they'd smile politely and change the subject to Victoria's latest promotion or James's newest acquisition. They couldn't see that I was developing the exact skills needed to run their father's empire, because those skills didn't come with prestigious degrees or impressive titles. Every summer, I proved myself capable of handling more responsibility and making meaningful contributions to the company's success. But every family gathering, I was still treated like the kid who couldn't figure out what she wanted to do with her life. The disconnect between who I was becoming and how they perceived me grew wider each year until I started to wonder if I was deluding myself about my own capabilities and potential. Part 6. The Critical Promise. The conversation that would change everything happened on a sweltering August afternoon during what I didn't know would be my last summer working with Grandpa Bob. We were sitting in his office after a particularly challenging day dealing with a supply shortage that threatened to delay 3 major projects. I'd spent hours on the phone with vendors, finding alternative sources and negotiating emergency deliveries, while Grandpa Bob handled the client communications and scheduling adjustments. As we sat there reviewing the solutions we'd implemented, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. There was pride there, but also something deeper, something that felt like a final assessment being completed. "Alex," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd made an important decision. "I need you to promise me something, and I need you to understand how serious this is." I set down the inventory reports I'd been organizing and gave him my full attention. Over the years, I'd learned that when Grandpa Bob used that particular tone, every word mattered. "These companies aren't just businesses," he continued, gesturing toward the window that overlooked the manufacturing floor where 30 employees were finishing their shifts. "Their responsibility. Every person working here depends on these jobs to feed their families, pay their mortgages, send their kids to college. The decisions we make don't just affect profit margins. They affect real lives." He leaned forward in his chair, his weathered hands clasped together on the desk between us. "If something ever happens to me, if these companies ever become your responsibility, I need your word that you'll remember what really matters. It's not about impressing people with fancy business strategies or maximizing shareholder value. It's about taking care of the people who've trusted us with their livelihoods and serving the community that supported us for decades." The promise he asked for seemed simple on the surface, but I understood the depth of what he was really requesting. He was asking me to prioritize people over profits, relationships over returns, and community over corporate advancement. He was asking me to carry forward the values that had built these companies from nothing into the backbone of Cedar Falls' economy. "I promise, Grandpa," I said, meaning every word. "If that responsibility ever becomes mine, I'll honor everything you've taught me about what really matters." What I didn't realize at the time was that this wasn't just a hypothetical conversation about distant future possibilities. This was Grandpa Bob's way of preparing me for a responsibility he already knew would be mine, while ensuring that I understood the moral weight that came with inheriting his life's work. Looking back now, I can see that every lesson, every summer, every late night spent learning the intricacies of running those companies had been leading to that moment of commitment. But sitting in that office, I thought I was simply reassuring an aging grandfather that his values would survive him, regardless of who eventually took control of his empire. Part 7. The Revealing Conversation. The real truth behind my family's reaction to the will reading came to light completely by accident 2 weeks later. I was sitting in my beat-up Honda Civic outside the Cedar Falls Country Club, waiting for my mother to finish what she'd described as a quick lunch meeting with Victoria and James. She'd asked me to drive her there because her car was in the shop, and I'd agreed, even though I knew I'd feel uncomfortable in that environment, where membership cost more than most people in town made in a year. I'd been scrolling through job listings on my phone, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do for the next 6 months before starting the business management program that would unlock my inheritance. The whole situation still felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. Part of me kept expecting Margaret Walsh to call and explain there'd been some terrible mistake, and the real will had been found, and I could go back to being the family disappointment instead of the unexpected heir to a $15 million empire. The country club's main dining room had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the parking lot. And from where I sat, I could see my family's table clearly. They'd chosen a spot in the corner away from other diners, which should have been my first warning that this wasn't just a casual family lunch. Victoria was leaning forward intensely, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing as she spoke. James kept checking his phone and nodding, his investment banker instincts clearly engaged in whatever they were discussing. My mother sat between them, looking uncomfortable, but listening intently to every word. I was about to put my earbuds in and ignore whatever business discussion they were having when I noticed Victoria pull out a manila folder and spread papers across their table. Even from the parking lot, I could see official-looking documents, and something about the urgent way they were reviewing them made me curious enough to crack my car windows. The September afternoon was warm, and the dining room windows were open to let in the breeze, which meant their voices carried farther than they probably realized. The key is proving diminished capacity, Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she used in business meetings. Dad was 83 years old and had been on medication for his heart condition. Any reasonable person would question whether he was thinking clearly when he made these changes to his will. James nodded approvingly, pulling out his own set of documents. I've already spoken with 3 probate attorneys in Chicago, and they all agree we have grounds for a legal challenge. The original will from 5 years ago left everything to the 3 of us equally, with Victoria as the executor. This new version, written just 6 months ago,
represents such a dramatic departure from his established intentions that it practically screams undue influence. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was witnessing. They weren't just disappointed about the inheritance, they were actively plotting to overturn Grandpa Bob's final wishes. But what came next was even worse than their legal maneuvering. The real problem, my mother said, her voice tight with frustration, is that Alexandra actually thinks she deserves this. She's been playing dress-up with construction equipment for years, but she has no real business experience, no formal education, no understanding of what it takes to run companies of this magnitude. Dad was clearly manipulated by her constant presence and her act of being the devoted granddaughter. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. Exactly. She's a 21-year-old with a community college degree who thinks operating a backhoe qualifies her to manage multi-million-dollar enterprises. The employees alone would revolt if they knew they were supposed to take orders from someone who's never even held a real job. It's almost insulting that Dad thought so little of the businesses he spent his life building that he'd hand them over to someone so completely unqualified. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to diminish everything I'd learned and accomplished during those 13 summers. They weren't just questioning my competence, they were rewriting history to erase the years of education and experience I'd gained working alongside their father. In their version of events, I was nothing more than a manipulative opportunist who'd taken advantage of an elderly man's declining mental state. James spread out what looked like financial projections on their table. The businesses are too valuable and too important to the community to risk on what amounts to Dad's sentimental experiment. Thompson Manufacturing alone employs over 100 people and has contracts worth millions of dollars. Cedar Valley Construction Supply is the primary building materials source for half the county. Midwest Logistics handles shipping for dozens of regional companies. These aren't operations you can learn by watching and helping out during summer vacations. The board members and key managers are already expressing concerns, Victoria added, consulting notes she'd apparently prepared in advance. Thomas Rivera called me yesterday asking if there was going to be continuity in leadership. He's worried about client confidence and employee morale if word gets out that a college student is supposed to be taking over operations. I assured him we were exploring all legal options to ensure stability. What struck me most painfully was how easily they dismissed not just my qualifications, but Grandpa Bob's judgment. They were talking about him like he'd been a confused old man who'd lost touch with reality, rather than the sharp, decisive business leader he'd remained right up until his death. They couldn't conceive that he might have made his decision deliberately, after years of observing and evaluating all of his potential heirs.
In their minds, the only explanation for choosing me was mental deterioration or manipulation. My mother's next comment was the one that broke my heart completely. The worst part is that she actually believes she's capable of handling this responsibility. She talks about those summers like they were some kind of advanced business school, when really she was just Dad's little helper, doing whatever busy work he could find for her. She has no idea how complex these operations really are, how many moving pieces require constant attention, how many relationships need to be maintained. She's going to destroy everything he worked for, and she won't even realize she's doing it until it's too late. I sat there in my car, hands shaking, as I listened to my own family systematically tear apart my character, my abilities, and my relationship with the man who'd been the most important person in my life. They weren't just planning to challenge the will, they were convinced they were saving the companies from my incompetence. They genuinely believed that Grandpa Bob had made a catastrophic mistake and that it was their duty to correct it, regardless of what he had actually wanted. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering legal strategies, financial projections, and timeline considerations for their challenge. They discussed which employees they could count on for support, which clients might be concerned about leadership changes, and which aspects of my background could be used to demonstrate my unsuitability for the position. They planned their attack with the precision of a military campaign, treating me not as a family member, but as an obstacle to be removed. When they finally finished their lunch and started gathering their papers, I quickly rolled up my windows and tried to compose myself. My mother walked out to the car 15 minutes later, smiling and chatting casually about the beautiful weather and asking about my job search, as if she hadn't just spent 2 hours plotting to destroy my future. I managed to make appropriate responses during the drive home, but inside I was reeling from the realization that my own family viewed me as both incompetent and dangerous. That night, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the business management program materials Margaret Walsh had given me, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was delusional to think 13 summers of hands-on experience had prepared me for this level of responsibility. Maybe Grandpa Bob had made his decision based on sentiment rather than sound business judgment. Maybe I really was just a naive kid who'd mistaken busy work for real education. But then I remembered the promise I'd made to him, and I realized something my family had overlooked in all their careful planning. They could challenge the will, question my qualifications, and undermine my confidence, but they couldn't change the fundamental truth that Grandpa Bob had chosen me for reasons they'd never bothered to understand. He hadn't made his decision in a moment of weakness or confusion. He'd made it after years of observation, teaching, and testing, and he'd structured the inheritance specifically to ensure I'd be prepared to handle the responsibility. Part 8. The Inner Transformation. That night, after listening to my family plot against me, I experienced something I'd never felt before. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was some of that burning in my chest. It wasn't hurt, although their words had cut deeper than I wanted to admit. What I felt was a crystalline moment of clarity, like suddenly seeing a puzzle picture that had been obscured by scattered pieces finally snap into perfect focus. I drove home from the country club in a daze, my mother chattering about her delicious salmon and how lovely the dining room looked with its new autumn decorations, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd overheard every word of their conspiracy. When I dropped her off at her house, she kissed my cheek and reminded me to call if I needed anything, the same way she had when I was a child. The normalcy of the gesture felt obscene after what I'd witnessed, but I managed to smile and promise to stay in touch. Back in my tiny apartment, I made a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table with Grandpa Bob's letter, the one Margaret Walsh had given me, along with all the legal documents about my inheritance. I'd read it probably 50 times since the will reading, but that night I read it with completely new understanding. Alexandra, it began in his careful handwriting, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility I've placed on your shoulders. I want you to know that this decision wasn't made lightly or recently. I've been watching and evaluating for years, and I'm more confident in your abilities than you might be in yourself right now. The letter went on to explain his reasoning in detail, describing specific situations where he'd observed my problem-solving skills, my natural leadership abilities, and my instinctive understanding of what motivated people. He wrote about conversations we'd had that I'd thought were just casual discussions, but which he'd recognized as moments when I demonstrated the kind of judgment and character he'd been looking for in a successor. Most importantly, he acknowledged that others might question his choice and that I would face resistance from people who couldn't see past conventional credentials to recognize real capability. The business world is full of people with impressive degrees and polished presentations who don't understand the first thing about building something that lasts, he wrote. They think leadership means making demands and maximizing profits, but real leadership means serving the people who depend on you and never forgetting that every decision affects real families. You understand this instinctively because you've lived it, not just studied it in some classroom. That's why I trust you with my life's work when I wouldn't trust it with people who have much more traditional qualifications. Sitting there reading his words, I realized that my family's reaction was exactly what he'd anticipated. Their dismissal of my capabilities wasn't a flaw in his planning, it was confirmation that he'd chosen correctly. They saw my background as a liability because they fundamentally misunderstood what these companies needed from their next leader. They wanted someone who would fit their image of what a business executive should look like, regardless of whether that person actually understood how to run the businesses successfully. But more than that, I understood for the first time that this wasn't really about me at all. This was about Grandpa Bob's vision for what these companies should become, and his determination to protect the values that had made them successful. He hadn't chosen me despite my unconventional background, he'd chosen me because of it. He knew that someone with traditional business training would be tempted to make changes that looked impressive on paper, but destroyed the relationships and culture that were the company's real foundation. The 6-month delay before I could officially take control wasn't just about giving me time to complete a business management program. It was about giving me time to prepare for the battles I would face, not just from outside competitors, but from within my own family. He'd structured the inheritance to protect both me and the companies from people who would try to undermine his decision based on prejudice and conventional thinking. As this realization settled over me, I felt something shift inside my chest. The insecurity and self-doubt that had plagued me since the will reading began to transform into something harder and more focused. I wasn't some lucky beneficiary who'd stumbled into an inheritance I didn't deserve. I was the person Grandpa Bob had deliberately chosen and carefully prepared for this exact situation. He knew his other children would react exactly as they had, and he trusted me to handle their resistance with the same steady determination I'd shown in learning his businesses. For the first time since his death, I smiled as I thought about what he'd set in motion. My family thought they were dealing with a naive college graduate who'd been handed something she couldn't handle. They had no idea they were actually facing someone who'd been trained for years to protect and grow the empire they thought they deserved. They'd underestimated both Grandpa Bob's strategic thinking and my own capabilities, and that miscalculation was going to cost them everything they thought they were entitled to. I pulled out a notebook and started making lists of everything I needed to accomplish over the next 6 months. Business management programs, certainly, but also building relationships with key employees, understanding the current financial position of all 3 companies, and identifying potential challenges that might arise during the transition. If my family wanted a fight, they were going to discover that Grandpa Bob had prepared me for exactly that scenario. The scared, uncertain girl who'd sat in Margaret Walsh's office 2 weeks ago was gone. In her place was someone who finally understood not just what she'd inherited, but why she'd inherited it, and what she was going to do to prove that Grandpa Bob's faith in her had been justified. Part 9. The Hidden Advantage. What my family didn't realize, what they couldn't have known because they'd never bothered to pay attention to the details of Grandpa Bob's business operations, was that their challenge to the will had actually triggered a series of safeguards he'd built into the company's structure years earlier. I discovered this completely by accident 3 days after overhearing their country club conspiracy, when I received an unexpected phone call from Thomas Rivera, the accountant who'd been managing the company's finances for over 15 years. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed unusual given how well we'd known each other during my summers working with Grandpa Bob. "I need to schedule a meeting with you as soon as possible. There are some aspects of your grandfather's estate planning that require immediate attention, and I'm not sure the other family members understand the full implications of the legal challenge they're pursuing." We met that afternoon at his office, a cluttered space above the hardware store downtown that looked exactly like what you'd expect from a small-town accountant who'd built his practice on relationships rather than flashy marketing. Thomas had been Grandpa Bob's friend long before he became his financial advisor, and I could see the genuine concern in his
Eyes as he spread out documents across his desk. "Your grandfather was a very careful man," Thomas began, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed paperwork that looked far more complex than I'd expected. He understood that family businesses often face challenges during succession, and he took steps to protect both the companies and his chosen heir from various forms of interference. "What I'm about to show you was meant to remain confidential unless certain conditions were met, but your family's legal challenge has activated provisions that I'm now obligated to disclose." The first document he showed me was a revised operating agreement for Thompson Manufacturing that had been filed with the state just 8 months before Grandpa Bob's death. According to the new terms, any attempt to challenge the designated successor's authority would result in immediate forfeiture of all family members' advisory positions and profit-sharing arrangements. Victoria, James, and my mother had all been receiving quarterly distributions from the company's profits for years, payments they'd considered guaranteed income that would continue regardless of who eventually took control. "But that's not the most significant protection he put in place," Thomas continued, pulling out another set of documents. "6 months ago, your grandfather restructured the ownership of all 3 companies under a family trust with very specific conditions. The trust can only be dissolved or modified with your consent as the primary beneficiary, and any legal challenge to your inheritance automatically triggers a clause that converts all outstanding family distributions into loans that must be repaid within 90 days. I stared at the paperwork, trying to process the implications of what he was telling me. "You're saying that by challenging the will, they've actually put themselves in debt to the companies?" Thomas nodded grimly. "Your Aunt Victoria has received approximately $40,000 annually from Thompson Manufacturing for the past 5 years. Your Uncle James has been getting similar distributions from Cedar Valley Construction Supply. Your mother's income from Midwest Logistics has been somewhat less, but still substantial. Under the terms of the trust, all of those payments are now considered loans that must be repaid immediately, with interest, or the recipients forfeit any future claim to family assets." But that's not the most devastating revelation. The final document Thomas showed me was a letter of intent that Grandpa Bob had filed with the company's primary insurance carrier, designating me as the sole authorized representative for all policy decisions and claims. The seemingly minor administrative detail had enormous implications because it meant that any disruption to company operations caused by family disputes would be considered an internal management issue rather than an external threat, potentially voiding coverage for business interruption losses. "Your family's legal challenge has created exactly the kind of internal disruption that could jeopardize the company's insurance protection," Thomas explained. "If clients start canceling contracts because they're concerned about leadership instability, or if key employees leave because they're worried about job security, the resulting losses won't be covered. The only way to maintain full coverage is to resolve the succession question quickly and definitively." What made this situation even more complex was that Grandpa Bob had also established performance benchmarks that had to be met during the transition period. If the company's revenues dropped by more than 10%, or if more than 15% of key employees left during the 6 months before I officially took control, additional penalties would be triggered that could dramatically reduce the overall value of the inheritance. This created a perverse incentive structure where my family's attempts to undermine my authority were actually working against their own financial interests. "The beautiful thing about your grandfather's planning," Thomas said with obvious admiration, "is that he created a system where challenging your inheritance becomes increasingly expensive and self-defeating.
the more aggressively your family fights this, the more money they'll owe, the more unstable they'll make the companies, and the more they'll prove that they don't understand the businesses well enough to run them effectively. I sat there absorbing this information, realizing that every summer I'd spent learning about the company's operations had also been preparation for understanding these exact contingencies. Grandpa Bob hadn't just taught me how to manage employees and maintain client relationships, he'd shown me how to protect the businesses from internal threats that could be more dangerous than any external competition. He knew that the greatest risk to his life's work wouldn't come from market changes or economic downturns, but from family members who would prioritize their own interests over the company's stability. The final piece of his protection strategy was perhaps the most elegant. Hidden within the trust documentation was a clause that allowed me to permanently exclude any family member from future inheritance considerations if they engaged in activities that threatened the company's viability. This wasn't just about the current legal challenge, it was about establishing clear consequences for anyone who put personal ambition ahead of the business's long-term success. Your grandfather spent 2 years developing this structure with attorneys in 3 different states, Thomas concluded. Every scenario your family might pursue has been anticipated and countered. He didn't just leave you these companies. He gave you every tool you'd need to protect them from people who would destroy what he built in order to get what they think they deserve. For the first time since the will reading, I understood the full scope of what Grandpa Bob had done. He hadn't just chosen an heir. He created an entire defensive system designed to ensure that his choice would be respected and that the companies would survive the transition intact. My family thought they were fighting against an inexperienced young woman who'd gotten lucky. They had no idea they were actually battling a carefully constructed legal and financial framework that turned their every move against them. Part 10. The Power Confrontation. The call came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after my meeting with Thomas Rivera, and I could hear the desperation in Victoria's voice despite her attempts to maintain her usual authoritative tone. Alexandra, we need to talk. There are some complications with the estate that require family discussion, and I think it would be best if we could resolve these issues privately before they become public.
Become more problematic. I almost laughed at the irony of her suddenly wanting private family discussion after spending weeks planning legal strategies with high-powered attorneys. But I agreed to meet her at Miller's Diner the next afternoon, partly out of curiosity about what approach she would take, and partly because I wanted to see her reaction when she realized exactly how much I knew about their situation. She arrived 15 minutes late, which was unusual for someone who prided herself on punctuality, and she looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. Her typically perfect appearance showed signs of strain, with subtle makeup that couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and a designer suit that seemed to hang differently on her frame. Jameis wasn't with her, which surprised me, and she explained that he'd returned to Chicago to handle some urgent business matters. What she didn't say, but what I suspected, was that he distanced himself from their legal challenge once the financial implications became clear. "I'm going to be direct with you," Victoria began after we'd ordered coffee, her hands folded carefully on the table in front of her. "Our attorneys have discovered some complications with Dad's estate planning that could create significant problems for everyone involved, including you. The trust structure he established has some unintended consequences that might make it impossible for you to actually take control of the companies, regardless of what the will says." I sipped my coffee and waited for her to continue, curious to see how she would frame the situation she'd created for herself. Her entire approach seemed designed to position herself as the reluctant bearer of bad news, rather than someone who'd actively created the problems she was describing. The issue is that challenging the succession plan, which our lawyers advised was necessary to protect the company's stability, has triggered some automatic penalties that are frankly unreasonable, she continued. Dad apparently included provisions that treat normal legal oversight as hostile action, which creates liability for family members who are only trying to ensure responsible management of his legacy.
The careful way she described their legal challenge as normal oversight and their conspiracy to overturn the will as ensuring responsible management was almost impressive in its audacity. She was trying to rewrite recent history to make herself look like a concerned family member rather than someone who'd spent weeks plotting to disinherit me. The practical result, Victoria said, leaning forward with what she probably thought was sincere concern, is that continuing with the current plan could bankrupt the family and destabilize the companies to the point where they become worthless to everyone. The trust penalties alone could force us to liquidate assets that have been in our family for generations. She paused, clearly expecting some kind of reaction from me, but I remained silent. The desperation behind her composed facade was becoming more apparent with each carefully chosen word. "What I'm proposing," Victoria said, leaning forward with what she probably thought was sincere concern, "is a compromise that protects everyone's interests while honoring Dad's intentions in a more practical way. If you're willing to modify the succession plan to include family oversight and professional management support, we can resolve the legal issues and ensure the company's stability. You would still be the primary heir, but with safeguards that protect both you and the businesses from the risks of inexperienced leadership." There it was. After weeks of questioning my competence and plotting to overturn Grandpa Bob's will, she was now offering to let me keep my inheritance as long as I agreed to let her control it. The compromise she was proposing would make me a figurehead while giving her and James the authority they'd expected to inherit in the first place. "I appreciate your concern," I said, setting down my coffee cup and meeting her eyes directly. "But I think you misunderstood something fundamental about Dad's planning. Those provisions you're calling unreasonable weren't unintended consequences. They were deliberate protections designed specifically to prevent exactly what you've been trying to do." Victoria's composed expression faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean by that." "I mean that Grandpa Bob anticipated that family members might challenge his decision based on conventional thinking about qualifications and succession. He built those penalties into the trust structure because he knew that anyone who truly understood his businesses and respected his judgment wouldn't try to overturn his choice. The fact that you triggered those consequences proves that you don't understand either the company's or his intentions." Her face began to flush, and I could see her struggling to maintain the calm, reasonable tone she had planned for this conversation. "Alexandra, you're a smart girl, but you don't understand the complexities of what you're dealing with. These companies require experienced management, not good intentions and summer job experience." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling to the notes I'd prepared, "Thompson Manufacturing's current backlog is worth $2.3 million, with delivery schedules that depend on maintaining relationships with 17 different suppliers. Cedar Valley Construction Supply serves 48 contractors throughout the region with inventory management that requires understanding seasonal fluctuations and emergency ordering patterns. Midwest Logistics coordinates shipping for 63 clients using a fleet of 22 trucks and a staff of 35 drivers." Victoria stared at me as I recited specific operational details that she clearly didn't know, despite her claims about understanding the company's complexities. "But more than that, I understand that Thompson Manufacturing's success isn't just about profit margins. It's about Jerry Kowalski being able to afford his daughter's college tuition because he's been a reliable welder for 12 years. It's about Maria Santos having health insurance when her husband was diagnosed with cancer because Grandpa Bob structured benefits to support families, not just individual employees. It's about building relationships with clients based on trust and quality rather than just underbidding competitors." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable pause Victoria had planned. This was the silence of someone realizing that all their assumptions had been completely wrong. "Here's what I understand about the situation you've created," I said, leaning back in my chair with the confidence that came from finally knowing exactly where I stood. "Your legal challenge has cost you approximately $200,000 in forfeited distributions that now have to be reinvested into the companies."
Repaid to the companies. James's involvement has jeopardized his own financial position to the point where he's apparently decided to distance himself from your strategy. And your attempts to destabilize the transition have created exactly the kind of internal disruption that Grandpa Bob designed his protections to prevent. Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "You think you're so clever, but you have no idea what you're destroying. These companies mean everything to this family, and you're going to ruin them with your arrogance and inexperience." "No," I said, standing up and leaving money on the table for my coffee. "Grandpa Bob built these companies to survive people who think family legacy is about inheritance rather than responsibility. You've spent so much time focused on what you thought you deserved that you never learned what these businesses actually need." As I walked toward the door, I turned back to see her sitting alone at that table, finally understanding that all her legal maneuvering and financial planning had been based on a fundamental miscalculation. She'd assumed that Grandpa Bob's choice of me was a mistake that could be corrected through superior strategy and conventional business thinking. She'd never considered that his decision was based on years of careful observation, and that her reaction to it would prove exactly why she wasn't the right person to carry on his legacy. Part 11. The Cascading Consequences. The fallout from Victoria's failed attempt at compromise began almost immediately and unfolded with the methodical precision of dominoes falling in a carefully arranged pattern. Within a week of our confrontation at Miller's Diner, Thomas Rivera called to inform me that both Victoria and my mother had contacted him separately, desperately seeking ways to restructure their debt to the companies or delay the 90-day repayment requirement that their legal challenge had triggered. "Your aunt seems particularly surprised by the interest calculations," Thomas told me, his voice carrying just a hint of satisfaction. "Apparently her attorneys didn't fully explain that the trust provisions include compound interest from the date of the original distributions, not just from when the legal challenge was filed. 5 years of accumulated payments at 8% annual interest creates a substantial obligation." What made the situation even more devastating for Victoria was that she'd structured her entire lifestyle around the assumption that her quarterly distributions were permanent income. She'd bought a house in the expensive part of town, leased luxury cars, and maintained a standard of living that required every penny of her corporate consulting income plus the family money. Suddenly facing a debt of nearly $300,000 with interest accumulating daily, she was discovering that her impressive business credentials didn't necessarily translate into personal financial management skills. James's situation was different, but equally problematic. His legal challenge had been based on his confidence that superior attorneys and strategic thinking could overcome what he viewed as an emotional rather than rational decision by his father. But the trust structure Grandpa Bob had created was apparently bulletproof, designed by estate planning specialists who'd anticipated every possible challenge strategy. James's Chicago lawyers were now advising him to settle quickly before additional penalties were triggered, which meant acknowledging that his evaluation of the situation had been completely wrong. The most unexpected consequence came when several key employees and long-term clients learned about the family dispute and began expressing concerns about the company's stability. Word travels fast in a small town like Cedar Falls, and the business community was closely watching how the succession would be handled. Margaret Walsh later told me that she'd received calls from 3 major clients asking whether they should be concerned about contract continuity, and 2 suppliers had inquired about payment terms and credit arrangements.
What surprised everyone, including me, was how quickly the employees rallied around defending Grandpa Bob's choice. Jerry Kowalski, the welder I'd mentioned to Victoria, organized an informal petition signed by over 60 employees expressing confidence in my eventual leadership and requesting that the family disputes be resolved without disrupting operations. Maria Santos from the accounting department sent me a handwritten note explaining that she'd watched me work alongside their boss for years and had never doubted that I understood what made the companies successful. Even more significant was the reaction from Dennis Murphy, the general manager of Thompson Manufacturing, who'd worked with Grandpa Bob for over 20 years. He called me directly to explain that he'd been fielding questions from worried employees and wanted to coordinate with me on maintaining stability during the transition period. "Miss Alexandra," he said, using the same respectful address he'd used when I was a teenager, learning to operate machinery, "your grandfather talked about you taking over someday for years. Anyone who spent time around him knew this wasn't a surprise decision. It's just that some family members weren't paying attention." The legal costs alone were destroying Victoria's financial position. Her attorneys in Cleveland were billing hourly rates that would have been manageable for a quick resolution, but the complex trust structure required extensive research and document review that stretched across months. James's Chicago firm was even more expensive, and their initial confidence about overturning the will had given way to increasingly cautious advice about cutting losses before the situation became even more expensive. But perhaps the most damaging consequence was how the family dispute was affecting my mother. Unlike Victoria and James, she'd never been particularly interested in the business aspects of Grandpa Bob's empire, preferring to think of her quarterly distributions as simply part of being his daughter, rather than compensation for any specific contribution. The revelation that her passive acceptance of family money had suddenly become a debt that could cost her house and savings was devastating someone who'd never had to think strategically about financial planning. The stress was taking a visible toll on all of them. Victoria's perfect appearance was becoming strained, with signs of weight loss and sleep depression that her expensive clothes couldn't disguise. James was making increasingly rare appearances in Cedar Falls, apparently focused on protecting his Chicago career from the fallout of his legal miscalculation.
Everyone. Most telling of all was how their unified front had collapsed once the financial reality became clear. Victoria and James were no longer coordinating their legal strategy, apparently each hoping to minimize their individual losses, regardless of what happened to the others. My mother was openly angry at both of them for involving her in a plan they'd assured her was legally sound and financially beneficial. The family that had seemed so united in dismissing my qualifications was fracturing under the pressure of consequences they'd never anticipated. Through it all, I maintained the same steady focus on preparing for my role that Grandpa Bob had taught me during those summer apprenticeships. I enrolled in the business management program, spending evenings studying corporate finance and organizational leadership while working part-time at the auto shop to support myself. I met regularly with Dennis Murphy and the other senior managers, learning about challenges and opportunities that would require attention once I officially took control. Most importantly, I continued building relationships with employees at all levels, understanding that their trust and confidence would be far more valuable than any legal victory. The contrast between my approach and my family's became more apparent every day. While they were consumed with legal strategies and financial calculations, I was focused on the operational details and human relationships that actually determined whether the companies would succeed or fail. While they were fighting over what they thought they deserved, I was preparing to earn what Grandpa Bob had entrusted to me. Part 12, The Fresh Beginning. 4 months after that disastrous confrontation at Miller's Diner, I was sitting in what would soon become my office at Thompson Manufacturing, reviewing quarterly reports with Dennis Murphy, and realizing just how much my perspective had changed since the day of Grandpa Bob's funeral. The scared, uncertain young woman who'd been shocked by the will reading had been replaced by someone who understood not just the mechanics of running these companies, but the deeper responsibility of carrying forward a legacy that was about much more than profit margins and quarterly distributions.
My business management program was nearly complete, and the coursework had provided exactly the theoretical framework I'd needed to complement the practical education I'd received during all those summers. But more importantly, the past months had given me time to build relationships with employees, suppliers, and clients that were based on my own competence, rather than just being Bob Thompson's granddaughter. I was no longer inheriting these companies as an untested outsider. I was stepping into leadership as someone who'd proven herself capable of handling the responsibility. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were mornings when I'd wake up overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead, nights when I'd question whether I really was ready for this level of responsibility. But every time doubt crept in, I'd remember the promise I'd made to Grandpa Bob and the trust he'd placed in me, and I'd find the strength to keep moving forward. The business management classes, the employee meetings, the late-night studying financial reports were all part of honoring that commitment. What surprised me most was how naturally the leadership role began to feel as I spent more time at the companies. The employees who'd seemed intimidating when I was a teenager working summer jobs now treated me as a colleague and future boss whose ideas were worth considering. Dennis Murphy had become not just a manager I needed to work with, but a mentor who was actively helping me prepare for the transition. Even Thomas Rivera, the accountant who'd initially seemed so formal, had begun to treat me as the decision maker rather than just Bob Thompson's heir. The contrast with my family situation couldn't have been more stark. The most unexpected development came when I received a call from Jennifer Walsh, Margaret's daughter who worked as a paralegal in the family law practice. She explained that Victoria had approached their firm about negotiating a settlement that would allow her to avoid the full financial penalties in exchange for permanently relinquishing any future claims to the family businesses. The irony was almost perfect. The woman who'd spent months arguing that I wasn't qualified to inherit was now desperately trying to sign away her own rights to avoid bankruptcy. She's offering to accept a significantly reduced settlement amount, Jennifer explained during our coffee meeting at the new cafe that had opened near the courthouse. Essentially, she wants to pay back about 60% of what she owes and walk away from any future involvement with the companies. She's also willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent her from discussing family business matters or making any public statements that could damage the company's reputation. The proposal revealed just how completely Victoria's position had deteriorated. The confident business executive who dismissed my qualifications was now offering to accept substantial financial losses just to escape a situation that was getting worse every day. Her legal bills alone had apparently exceeded $50,000, and her attorneys were now advising her that continuing the challenge would likely result in additional penalties that could force her into personal bankruptcy. But what made her desperation even more apparent was the personal cost the dispute had taken on her marriage and social standing. David, her husband, had apparently grown tired of the constant stress and financial uncertainty that Victoria's legal battle was creating for their household. Several people had mentioned seeing him at local events without her, and there were rumors that he was questioning whether their lifestyle was sustainable given the mounting legal expenses and debt obligations. The country club membership that had seemed so important to Victoria's image was apparently one of the first casualties of her financial problems. The quarterly fees and social obligations that had once seemed like minor expenses became impossible to maintain when facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in unexpected debt. Friends who'd supported her challenge to my inheritance were now distancing themselves as it became clear that her strategy had backfired spectacularly. My mother's situation was different, but equally telling. Unlike Victoria, she'd never been the driving force behind the legal challenge, preferring to follow her siblings' lead rather than develop her own strategy. But the financial consequences were devastating someone who'd lived comfortably on passive income for years without ever developing the skills needed to handle a crisis of this magnitude.
Her house was mortgaged to a level that made the loan payments difficult even when she was receiving quarterly distributions, and the sudden debt obligation meant she was facing the possibility of losing her home. The emotional toll on her was perhaps even worse than the financial impact. She'd spent years criticizing my choices and expressing disappointment that I hadn't followed a more conventional path. But now she was forced to confront the reality that her own life had been built on money she hadn't earned through any particular effort or competency.
The quarterly checks she'd taken for granted had come from businesses she'd never bothered to understand, managed by a father whose judgment she'd questioned when it didn't align with her preferences. James had taken a different approach, quietly withdrawing from the legal challenge and focusing on minimizing his personal exposure. His Chicago law firm had apparently advised him that the trust structure was legally unassailable and that continuing to fight would only increase his financial obligations without any realistic chance of success. But his retreat from the family dispute had come at the cost of his relationships with Victoria and my mother, who felt abandoned by someone they'd counted on for strategic guidance. His decision to settle quickly and quietly also revealed something about his character that hadn't been apparent during the initial stages of the challenge. Despite his impressive credentials and professional success, he'd apparently been motivated more by greed than by genuine concern about the company's future. Once it became clear that challenging my inheritance would cost him money rather than make him money, his interest in protecting Grandpa Bob's legacy evaporated completely. The community's reaction to the family dispute had been overwhelmingly supportive of my eventual leadership, but it had also been educational about the difference between respect earned through contribution and respect assumed through position. Employees at all three companies had watched the legal battle unfold with growing disgust at how my family members were willing to jeopardize everyone's job security in pursuit of money they hadn't worked for. The contrast between their behavior and my consistent focus on learning the business had made it clear to everyone who actually cared about the company's success. Local business owners who'd worked with Grandpa Bob for decades began reaching out to me directly, offering support and advice for the transition period. Some shared stories about deals they'd made based on handshake agreements with my grandfather, emphasizing that his word had been worth more than any contract. Others expressed confidence that I'd learned the same values during my apprenticeship with him, and that they looked forward to continuing those relationships under my leadership. The most meaningful endorsement came from Father Martinez at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, where Grandpa Bob had been a longtime member and generous contributor. During his Sunday sermon the week before my official transition, he spoke about the difference between inheritance and legacy, explaining that money and property could be left to anyone, but that values and character had to be earned through years of consistent behavior. Everyone in the congregation understood that he was talking about the family dispute, and that his words represented the community's verdict on who deserved to carry forward Bob Thompson's life work. But perhaps the most satisfying development was how the employees themselves had begun to take ownership of the transition process. Dennis Murphy had organized informal meetings where senior staff discussed ways to support my leadership and ensure continuity during the changeover. Maria Santos had worked with Tomas Rivera to prepare detailed financial summaries that would help me understand each company's current position and immediate challenges. Even the truck drivers at Midwest Logistics had developed contingency plans for maintaining delivery schedules during any potential disruption. Their initiative demonstrated something that my family had never understood about these businesses. Success wasn't dependent on having the right credentials or making impressive strategic decisions from a corporate office. It was built on relationships, trust, and the day-to-day commitment of people who took pride in their work and believed in the mission of the organization. Grandpa Bob hadn't just built companies. He'd created communities of people who were invested in each other's success. As I prepared for the final month before officially taking control, I realized that the legal challenge had actually strengthened my position in ways that wouldn't have been possible if the transition had proceeded smoothly. The crisis had forced me to demonstrate leadership under pressure, to build alliances based on competence rather than family connection, and to prove that I could handle adversity with the same steady determination that had made Grandpa Bob successful. More importantly, the dispute had clarified the difference between people who were committed to the company's mission and those who were simply interested in financial gain. The employees, suppliers, and clients who'd supported me during the controversy were now allies who'd proven their loyalty when it mattered most. The family members who'd opposed me had revealed that their relationship with Grandpa Bob's legacy was purely transactional, based on what they could get rather than what they could contribute. Part 13, The Complete Reversal. The final resolution came exactly 6 months after Grandpa Bob's funeral, on a crisp March morning that felt like the beginning of something entirely new rather than just the official transfer of authority I'd been anticipating.
I walked into the conference room at Walsh & Associates for what Margaret had described as the final administrative meeting to complete my inheritance, but what I discovered was a gathering that represented a complete transformation of the power dynamics that had shaped my family for decades. Victoria was there, but she looked like a different person from the confident business executive who dismissed my qualifications at the country club 6 months earlier. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a simple black suit that showed signs of wear, and her perfectly styled hair had grown out to a length that suggested professional salon visits were no longer affordable. But more than her appearance, her entire demeanor had changed from authoritative to resigned, from commanding to almost apologetic. James had driven down from Chicago specifically for this meeting, which surprised me because I assumed he would handle everything through his attorneys to avoid the personal awkwardness of facing me directly. But his presence revealed
Something about his character that I hadn't expected. Despite his mistakes and miscalculations, he apparently felt obligated to acknowledge the situation personally rather than hiding behind legal representatives. My mother was the most difficult to look at because the strain of the past 6 months had taken a visible toll on someone who'd never had to handle serious adversity before. She'd aged in ways that went beyond just the passage of time, with worry lines that spoke to sleepless nights and financial stress that had been completely foreign to her previous experience. But there was also something in her expression that looked like relief, as if the uncertainty and conflict were finally ending, regardless of the outcome. Margaret Walsh presided over the meeting with the professional neutrality that had made her the logical choice to handle such a sensitive family matter, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes as she reviewed documents that represented the complete vindication of her client's estate planning strategy. Every contingency Grandpa Bob had anticipated had played out exactly as he'd predicted, and his faith in both his legal structure and his chosen heir had been proven correct. The first order of business, Margaret began, is to formally complete the transfer of authority to Alexandra Thompson as the sole owner and CEO of Thompson Manufacturing, Cedar Valley Construction Supply, and Midwest Logistics Solutions. All required conditions have been met, including successful completion of the Business Management Certification Program and maintenance of operational stability during the transition period. She handed me a folder containing official documents that represented legal control of my grandfather's empire, but the papers felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had happened during the previous months. The real transfer of power had occurred gradually, through relationships built and trust earned, rather than in a single moment of legal formality. The second matter, Margaret continued, concerns the resolution of debt obligations and legal settlements with family members who challenged the original inheritance structure. She turned to Victoria first, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone delivering business information rather than personal judgment. Victoria Thompson Hayes has agreed to a settlement that requires payment of $180,000 to the family trust, representing approximately 70% of her accumulated debt obligation. In exchange, she permanently relinquishes any claim to family business assets and agrees to refrain from any public statements or actions that could damage the company's reputation or operations. Victoria signed the papers without comment, her movements mechanical and defeated. The woman who'd once commanded boardrooms and intimidated subordinates was now just someone trying to escape a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her control. Her signature on those documents represented not just a financial settlement, but the end of any pretense that she'd ever understood what Grandpa Bob had been building or why he'd chosen me to continue his work. James's settlement was more straightforward, reflecting his decision to withdraw from the legal challenge before the penalties became even more severe. He owed approximately $120,000, which he'd agreed to pay in full within 90 days in exchange for a complete release from any future obligations or claims. His Chicago legal background had apparently taught him to cut losses quickly rather than escalate a losing position. Finally, Margaret said, turning to my mother, Elizabeth Thompson Morgan has requested a different arrangement that reflects her specific circumstances and her desire to maintain some connection to the family businesses. This was the first I'd heard of any special consideration for my mother, and I looked at her with curiosity about what she might have proposed. Rather than a cash settlement, Margaret explained,
Elizabeth has offered to transfer ownership of her house to the family trust in exchange for cancellation of her debt obligations and the right to remain as a tenant paying market-rate rent. This arrangement protects her from displacement while ensuring that the trust recovers the full value of her accumulated distributions. My mother's choice revealed something about her priorities that I found both sad and admirable. Rather than fighting to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't afford, she'd chosen security and stability, even if it meant acknowledging that her previous comfort had been dependent on money she hadn't earned. Her willingness to become a tenant in her own house was a form of humility that Victoria and James had been unwilling to accept. But the most unexpected element of the meeting was what happened after all the legal formalities were completed. Victoria, who I'd expected to leave immediately after signing her papers, instead remained in her seat and asked if she could speak with me privately. Margaret and the others stepped out of the conference room, leaving us alone for the first time since our confrontation at Miller's Diner. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said, her voice lacking any of the confidence and authority that had characterized our previous conversations. "Not just for challenging the will, but for never bothering to understand what Dad was trying to teach us about these businesses. I spent so many years focused on my own career and my own success that I never paid attention to what Dad was actually building here." She paused, looking around the conference room as if seeing it clearly for the first time. "I thought business was about credentials and strategy and making the right connections. I never understood that what Dad created was about relationships and trust and taking care of people who depend on you. You learned that, and I didn't, and that's why he chose you instead of me." Her acknowledgement was more meaningful than any legal victory could have been because it represented genuine understanding rather than just acceptance of defeat. She finally recognized that Grandpa Bob's decision had been based on wisdom rather than sentiment, and that my qualifications were real even if they didn't fit conventional expectations. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect any special consideration because we're family, but I want you to know that I finally understand why Dad trusted you with his life's work, and I hope you'll be successful in ways that I never could have been." When James returned to the conference room, he offered his own form of acknowledgement, though his was more practical than emotional. "If you ever need financial advice or connections in Chicago, I'll be available. I know I forfeited any right to be involved in the family businesses, but I'd like to find some way to support what Dad wanted, even if it's from a distance." My mother's approach was the most direct and personal. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to see what your grandfather saw in you. I hope you'll let me be part of your life, even if I can't be part of the business anymore." As we left Margaret's office that afternoon, I realized that the complete reversal wasn't just about legal control or financial outcomes. It was about the transformation of relationships and the establishment of new understanding about what mattered most. The family members who'd once dismissed me were now acknowledging my competence, while the community that had watched our dispute unfold was ready to support my leadership. The companies I was inheriting were stronger than they'd been 6 months earlier. Not despite the legal challenge, but because of it. The crisis had tested every relationship, every system, and every assumption, and everything that survived had proven its worth under pressure. I wasn't just taking control of my grandfather's businesses. I was leading organizations that had been strengthened by adversity and unified by shared commitment to values that transcended personal ambition. Part 14. The Wisdom Conclusion. Today, as I sit in the office that was once Grandpa Bob's, surrounded by the photographs and mementos that tell the story of 40 years of building something meaningful, I often think about how different my life might have been if my family had simply accepted his choice without question. There's a part of me that wonders if I would have grown into this role as confidently if I hadn't been forced to prove myself under the harsh scrutiny of people who doubted every aspect of my qualifications. The past 2 years since officially taking control have been filled with challenges that my business management courses never covered, and successes that I couldn't have imagined when I was sitting in that cemetery listening to dirt hit my grandfather's coffin. Thompson Manufacturing has expanded into new markets, securing contracts with clients who value our reputation for quality and reliability over simply offering the lowest bid. Cedar Valley Construction Supply has become the preferred vendor for contractors throughout the region, not just because of our inventory and pricing, but because of relationships built on trust and mutual respect.
Midwest logistics has perhaps seen the most dramatic growth, as our commitment to treating drivers as valued professionals rather than just equipment operators has attracted some of the best talent in the industry. We've expanded our fleet and our service area, but more importantly, we've created a workplace culture that people are proud to be part of. When other companies struggle with driver retention and service quality, we have waiting lists of qualified applicants who want to work for an organization that treats people with dignity. The financial results have exceeded every projection Thomas Rivera prepared during the transition period, but the numbers tell only part of the story. What matters more is the way employees talk about their work when they think no one important is listening. The letters we receive from clients expressing appreciation for service that goes beyond contractual obligations. And the recognition from community organizations that these companies remain committed to supporting the people and causes that make Cedar Falls a good place to live and work. Victoria's prediction that I would destroy everything Grandpa Bob had built has proven to be completely wrong. But I understand now that her mistake wasn't just about misjudging my capabilities. She'd fundamentally misunderstood what success looked like in these particular businesses, because she'd been trained to think in terms of quarterly profits and corporate advancement rather than sustainable relationships and community impact. Her background had prepared her for a different kind of business environment, one where credentials mattered more than character, and strategic planning mattered more than daily execution. The wisdom I've gained from this experience goes far beyond business management techniques or leadership strategies. I've learned that respect can't be inherited or purchased. It has to be earned through consistent behavior over time. I've discovered that the most valuable qualifications aren't the ones that look impressive on paper, but the ones that prepare you to handle responsibility when circumstances become difficult. Most importantly, I've understood that true success isn't measured by how much you can accumulate for yourself, but by how much value you can create for others. My relationship with my family has evolved into something healthier and more honest than it was before the inheritance dispute forced us all to confront our assumptions and motivations. Victoria has successfully rebuilt her consulting practice, focusing on smaller clients who value her experience with family business dynamics. Her financial situation has stabilized, and she seems genuinely happier working with organizations where her skills are a better fit for the challenges they face. James visits Cedar Falls several times a year, and we've developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. His expertise in financial markets has been helpful as we've evaluated expansion opportunities and investment strategies, but our interactions are now professional collaborations rather than family negotiations. He's never asked to be involved in day-to-day operations, understanding that his role is as an advisor rather than a decision maker. My mother has become one of my most reliable supporters, frequently attending company events and community functions where her presence demonstrates family unity behind the leadership transition. Living as a tenant in her former house has apparently given her a perspective on financial responsibility that she'd never developed during her years as a passive beneficiary of family wealth. She's found part-time work with a local nonprofit organization using skills she'd never had the opportunity to develop during her years as a passive beneficiary of family wealth. The employees who supported me during the transition have grown into leadership roles that reflect their capabilities and commitment to the company's mission. Dennis Murphy was promoted to Regional Operations Manager with authority over all three companies' day-to-day operations. Maria Santos became Chief Financial Officer, bringing the same attention to detail and ethical standards to financial management that she demonstrated as an accounting clerk. Several of the truck drivers who had organized contingency plans during the crisis have been promoted to supervisory positions, proving that leadership potential exists at every level of the organization. But perhaps the most meaningful change has been in how we approach succession planning and employee
Development throughout the companies. Every person we hire now receives mentoring and cross-training that prepares them for advancement opportunities, ensuring that institutional knowledge and company values are passed along systematically rather than accidentally. We've established scholarship programs for employees' children, internship opportunities for local students, and partnerships with regional educational institutions that create pathways for young people to build careers in manufacturing, logistics, and construction. The lesson I want people to understand from my story isn't that family conflicts are inevitable or that business success requires rejecting conventional wisdom. What I learned is that real leadership means understanding what matters most and having the courage to protect it, even when that puts you in conflict with people whose approval you'd prefer to have. Grandpa Bob's greatest gift to me wasn't the companies themselves, but the confidence to trust my own judgment when others questioned my capabilities. Sometimes I walk through the manufacturing floor or visit job sites where our crews are working, and I see the same pride and dedication that I remember from my teenage summers learning alongside my grandfather. The faces have changed as older employees have retired and new people have joined our teams, but the culture of mutual respect and shared commitment has remained constant. That continuity represents the real measure of whether I've succeeded in honoring the responsibility he entrusted to me. The revenge story that people might expect, where the family members who doubted me suffered dramatic consequences while I enjoy obvious victories, never actually materialized because it was never what this was really about. What happened instead was something more subtle and more lasting. The gradual recognition that character and competence matter more than credentials and connections, and that the best way to prove your worth is simply to do the work consistently and with integrity. When young people visit our companies for school tours or internship interviews, I always tell them the same thing Grandpa Bob told me during that first summer when I thought I was just helping out at construction sites. The most valuable education comes from paying attention to how successful people treat others when they don't have to, learning from people who've built something lasting rather than just something impressive, and understanding that real leadership means serving the people who depend on you rather than being served by them. The letter he wrote to me, the one I keep framed on my desk next to my community college diploma, ends with words that have become my guide for every important decision. Remember that everything worthwhile is built one relationship at a time, one honest interaction at a time, one kept promise at a time. The world is full of people who can impress you with their credentials, but what we need are people who can be trusted with responsibility when no one is watching. That trust, earned through years of proving myself in small ways before being tested in larger ones, has become the foundation of everything we've accomplished since. It's what enables employees to suggest improvements without fear of criticism, clients to rely on our commitments without extensive contracts, and community organizations to partner with us on projects that benefit everyone rather than just our bottom line. The businesses Grandpa Bob built weren't successful because they generated impressive profits, though they certainly did that. They were successful because they created value for everyone involved, and that's the legacy I'm committed to continuing for as long as I'm responsible for carrying it forward. 5 years have passed since that rain-soaked morning when I stood beside Grandpa Bob's grave, feeling like an outsider at my own family's funeral. Today, as I watch my newest employees receive their first-year recognition awards at our annual company celebration, I'm struck by how completely my understanding of success has transformed since those early days when I measured my worth by other people's expectations rather than my own accomplishments. The celebration is taking place in the newly expanded Thompson manufacturing facility, a building that didn't exist when I inherited these companies, but now houses our most advanced production equipment and serves as headquarters for operations that extend far beyond Cedar Falls. The expansion wasn't driven by ego or ambition, but by the organic growth that comes when you consistently deliver value to clients who trust your commitment to excellence. Every new contract, every additional employee, every piece of upgraded equipment represents relationships built on reliability rather than promises made to impress. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that represent 3 generations of workers, I see the living proof that Grandpa Bob's vision for these companies was about much more than generating profits for family members. Jerry Kowalski's son Michael just completed his apprenticeship program and is already showing the same dedication to craftsmanship that made his father one of our most valued employees. Maria Santos's daughter graduated from the university scholarship program we established and has returned as our new systems analyst, bringing fresh perspectives to operations while maintaining the customer service standards that built our reputation.
The warehouse manager who's introducing tonight's speakers is Carmen Rodriguez, a woman who started as a part-time inventory clerk 3 years ago and demonstrated such natural leadership abilities that we created new positions to match her growing responsibilities. Her journey from entry-level employee to senior management illustrates something I've learned about talent development that no business school textbook could have taught me. People's potential isn't determined by their starting point or their educational credentials, but by their willingness to grow and their commitment to contributing something meaningful to the organization's mission. The financial results we're celebrating tonight reflect growth that has exceeded every projection Thomas Rivera prepared during those uncertain months when my family was challenging the inheritance. Thompson Manufacturing has secured multi-year contracts with automotive suppliers throughout the Midwest based on our reputation for meeting impossible deadlines without compromising quality standards. Cedar Valley Construction Supply has become the preferred vendor for commercial developers in 3 states, not because we offer the lowest prices, but because contractors know they can depend on our inventory management and delivery reliability. Midwest Logistics has perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation, evolving from a regional trucking company into a sizable regional logistics provider.
Comprehensive supply chain management service that helps small and medium-sized businesses compete with much larger corporations. Our drivers are now logistic consultants who understand their clients' operations well enough to suggest improvements that save time and money while building stronger relationships. The waiting list for employment with our transportation division includes experienced drivers from companies that pay higher wages, but don't offer the respect and professional development opportunities that have become our signature. But the numbers and the growth statistics, impressive as they are, tell only part of the story about what these companies have become under my leadership. The real measure of our success is visible in smaller details that visitors might not notice, but that employees and clients recognize as evidence of an organizational culture that values people over processes. The break rooms in all our facilities include comfortable furniture and well-stocked kitchens where employees can share meals and build relationships that extend beyond work assignments. The employee parking areas are paved and well-lit with covered walkways that protect people from weather during shift changes. Every facility includes training rooms equipped with the latest educational technology, where employees can develop new skills during paid time rather than being expected to pursue advancement opportunities on their own schedules. The company library contains technical manuals and industry publications, but also books on leadership, communication, and personal development that reflect our belief that investing in people's growth benefits everyone involved. These aren't expensive gestures designed to impress visitors, but practical investments in creating an environment where people can do their best work while feeling valued for their contributions. The community impact of our growth extends far beyond the direct employment we provide, though our payroll now supports over 400 families in a region where good jobs have become increasingly scarce as other industries have moved operations to lower-cost locations. Local suppliers have expanded their own operations to meet our increased demand for materials and services, creating a multiplier effect that strengthens the entire economic ecosystem. The scholarship programs we've established have enabled dozens of young people to pursue higher education who might otherwise have been limited to whatever opportunities they could find immediately after high school. Our apprenticeship partnerships with regional technical colleges have created career pathways that combine practical experience with formal education, producing graduates who are immediately productive while continuing to develop advanced skills throughout their careers. These programs have become models that other companies are adopting, spreading the impact of our human development philosophy beyond our own operations. The State Economic Development Agency has featured our approach in promotional materials designed to attract new businesses to Ohio, recognizing that our success demonstrates the viability of manufacturing operations that prioritize employee development and community engagement.
Ended has made her a more thoughtful and confident person who contributes meaningfully to conversations about community development and social responsibility. Her position as a tenant in her former house has eliminated the stress and uncertainty that characterized her final years as an owner, struggling with mortgage payments she couldn't afford, while her reduced living expenses have enabled her to focus on work she finds meaningful rather than employment she might need for financial survival. The arrangement that initially seemed like a humiliating defeat has become a source of stability and independence that has improved her quality of life in ways she never anticipated. The employees who supported my leadership during the transition period have grown into roles that reflect their capabilities and their commitment to the company's mission, creating a management structure built on proven performance rather than inherited authority or educational credentials. Dennis Murphy's promotion to Regional Operations Director has given him oversight responsibilities that extend to all our facilities, while his deep understanding of our culture ensures that expansion doesn't compromise the values that made us successful. His leadership style, learned through years of working with Grandpa Bob, combines high expectations with genuine care for people's development and well-being. Maria Santos's role as Chief Financial Officer has evolved to include strategic planning responsibilities that reflect her understanding of how financial decisions affect employee morale and client relationships, not just profit margins. Her accounting background provides the technical expertise necessary for managing complex operations, while her years of observing our culture from an administrative perspective have given her insights into what motivates people and what builds lasting business relationships. The promotion opportunities we've created for drivers, warehouse workers, and production employees have attracted talented people who might otherwise have pursued careers elsewhere, while our commitment to internal advancement has reduced training costs and improved productivity by retaining institutional knowledge that would otherwise be lost to turnover. The leadership development programs we've established ensure that promotion decisions are based on demonstrated capabilities rather than favoritism or politics, creating clear pathways for advancement that motivate people to invest in their own growth while contributing to organizational success. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of our growth has been the recognition that true success isn't measured by comparison to competitors or by meeting financial benchmarks, but by the impact we have on the lives of people who depend on us for their livelihoods and the communities that support our operations. The letters we receive from employees' spouses thanking us for providing stable employment that enables their families to plan for the future remind me that business decisions have consequences that extend far beyond spreadsheets and profit projections. The gratitude expressed by suppliers who've grown their own operations to meet our increased demand demonstrates that successful businesses create opportunities for others rather than simply capturing market share from competitors. The recognition we've received from community organizations for our support of local causes reflects our understanding that businesses have responsibilities that go beyond generating returns for owners or shareholders. The young people who participate in our internship programs and scholarship opportunities represent investments in future leadership that will extend our impact far beyond the current operations of these three companies. Some will return to work for us after completing their education, bringing fresh perspectives and advanced skills that will drive continued innovation. Others will use their education and experience to start their own businesses or advance in other organizations, carrying forward the values and work ethic they learned during their time with us. The legacy that Grandpa Bob created wasn't just about building successful businesses, though he certainly achieved that objective. His real accomplishment was demonstrating that commercial success and social responsibility aren't competing objectives, but complementary strategies that reinforce each other when properly understood and consistently implemented. The companies he left me weren't just valuable assets, but examples of how business can be a force for community development and individual opportunity when guided by leaders who understand their responsibilities to all stakeholders. The wisdom I've gained from this experience extends far beyond the technical skills needed to manage complex operations or the leadership techniques required to motivate diverse teams. I've learned that respect can't be inherited or purchased, but must be earned through consistent behavior that demonstrates competence and character. I've discovered that the most valuable qualifications aren't always the ones that look impressive on paper, but the ones that prepare you to handle responsibility when circumstances become challenging. Most importantly, I've understood that true leadership means serving the people who depend on you,
Rather than being served by them, creating value for others rather than simply capturing value for yourself,
and building something that will last beyond your own involvement, rather than just something that will benefit you personally. These aren't abstract principles learned from textbooks or seminars, but practical insights gained through years of observing how successful people actually behave when faced with difficult decisions. The story that began with my family dismissing my qualifications and questioning my grandfather's judgment has evolved into a demonstration that character and competence matter more than credentials and connections, that sustainable success requires investing in people rather than just exploiting opportunities, and that the best way to honor someone's legacy is to carry forward their values rather than just inherit their assets. Today, as I look around this celebration and see the faces of people whose lives have been improved by the opportunities we've created together, I understand that the real measure of my success isn't found in financial statements or growth statistics, but in the knowledge that we've built something worthy of the trust that was placed in us. The companies that Grandpa Bob entrusted to me have become more than he probably imagined they could be, not because I was smarter or more capable than he anticipated, but because he gave me the foundation and the confidence to grow into responsibilities that seemed overwhelming when I first inherited them. The promise I made to him about remembering what really matters has guided every significant decision I've made as a leader, ensuring that growth and profitability serve the larger purpose of creating opportunities for people and strengthening the communities that support our operations. That commitment, more than any business strategy or operational improvement, has been the key to transforming companies that were already successful into organizations that represent the best of what business can accomplish when guided by leaders who understand their responsibilities to all stakeholders. As tonight's celebration continues, and I watch employees from all levels of our organization sharing stories and celebrating achievements, I'm reminded that the most satisfying aspect of this journey hasn't been proving my critics wrong or exceeding financial expectations, but creating an environment where people can do meaningful work while building better lives for themselves and their families. That impact, multiplied across hundreds of employees and thousands of community members, represents the true legacy of everything we've accomplished together since that gray morning when I inherited more than I knew how to handle, but was determined to prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in me. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.